King William Wolfheart, whose titles included the words Slayer, Conqueror, and Unflinching, was flinching. He was flinching spectacularly. He stood exactly 49 feet from the edge of the royal apiary, a distance he'd measured that morning with a length of twine and a profound sense of self-loathing. One more foot. He had promised himself he would manage one more foot today. Mate! His wolf slammed the thought into his forebrain like a battering ram. The wolf, the part of him that noticed exits before he sat down and filed every human being in a room by threat level before he'd finished saying hello, had exactly one setting when it came to Clover Wynn, and that setting was unhinged. She is there. The sun gleams in her hair like honey. Her scent is wildflowers and summer and everything good. William took a deep, steadying breath, preparing to take the momentous step. 48 feet. He could do it. For her. For Clover Wynn, the woman whose existence had turned his internal landscape into a war between a lovesick poet and a gibbering coward. Then, a low buzz drifted on the breeze. A single exploratory hum from one of Clover's thousands of tiny winged assassins. Every nerve ending he had fired at once. The part of his mind that had been mapping threat vectors and calculating romantic approach angles went instantly, catastrophically offline. His entire consciousness collapsed to a single frequency. They know we're here. Evacuate the monarch. William's foot, which had been hovering over the precipice of 48 feet, slammed back down to the safety of 49. His shoulders slumped. Every instinct was trying to climb up his own spine and hide behind his brain. It was a humiliating sensation. From her position beside a row of brightly painted hives, Clover Wynn watched him. She didn't cross her arms. She didn't tap her foot. She just stood there, her expression as placid as a mill pond, which was somehow infinitely more intimidating. She wore no beekeeper's veil, no gloves, no suit, just a simple linen dress, her brown hair tied back in a practical braid, and a smoker in one hand held like it was a scepter. Which, in her kingdom, it was. It was the kind of thing that unsettled visitors, a woman standing bare-armed in a cloud of stinging insects as casually as if they were butterflies. But Clover had earned that ease over a lifetime. She'd been raised among hives. Her mother had been a beekeeper, and her mother before that. She'd taken her first sting at age 3 and her last at age 15. Not because the bees had stopped being capable of stinging, but because somewhere in the intervening years, a quiet symbiosis had taken root. Her wolf nature, the part of every shifter that communicated through scent, through pheromones layered beneath conscious thought, had grown up marinated in the chemical language of the hive. The bees read her the way they read their own queen, through the subtle shifts in the pheromones her skin breathed into the air. Calm radiated calm. Intent became direction. Over 2 decades, her scent had become part of their world, and their world had become part of hers. She didn't need a suit for the same reason a mother doesn't need armor around her own children. They knew her. She was hive. It was not a common gift. Other wolf shifters who visited the apiary still wore veils. Her young apprentice, Marin, a sharp-eyed girl of 17 who had been studying under Clover for 2 years, still wore full protective gear, though she was learning to move with the same measured calm that Clover modeled. Your scent tells them everything, Clover had told her once. Fear smells like a threat. Calm smells like home. The suit is for your confidence until your body learns to stop lying to them, which made the king's situation all the more absurd. Because here was the thing about bee stings and werewolves that made William's terror almost cosmically ridiculous. For a grown alpha, they barely mattered. A full-grown alpha's body metabolized venom the way it metabolized a splinter, burning through the toxin in minutes, the sting fading to nothing before most humans would have finished swelling. The stronger the wolf, the less the sting registered. For an alpha of William's power, 100 bees could sting him at once, and the worst he'd suffer would be a brief, sharp annoyance, like being flicked on the arm 100 times. Not pleasant, but about as medically threatening as a light rain. The vulnerability was real for others, though. Pups whose wolf healing hadn't yet fully developed could swell dangerously from even a few stings. Omegas, whose wolf nature ran gentler and closer to human baseline, were more susceptible. Even betas could have genuine reactions to a concentrated attack. The hierarchy of the pack was, in this one absurd way, also a hierarchy of sting resistance. And the man at the very top of it, the most sting-proof person in the entire kingdom, was the one who couldn't get within 50 feet of a beehive. William, of course, did not know this about himself. He'd been stung once as a 4-year-old pup before his alpha healing had come into its own. It had been the worst pain of his young life, and because he had never allowed himself to be stung again, he had never learned that his adult body would barely register what his childhood body had found devastating. His fear had frozen him in the experience of a pup, and the pup's experience was the only data he had. The wolf side of Clover's mind, the part that cataloged everything in crisp operational reports, while the rest of her was trying to have a normal thought, filed its daily assessment. Target remained stationary at designated perimeter. Violation of courtship protocol, day 12. Pathetic. And there was the other side of the equation. If calm smelled like home, then whatever King William Wolfheart was broadcasting from 50 feet away smelled like a 5-alarm fire in a gunpowder factory. His wolf side was pumping fear scent into the air with the subtlety of a foghorn. The bees wouldn't attack him for it while Clover's presence was the dominant signal in the apiary, her calm overriding his panic in their chemical calculus. But if she weren't here, if he walked into the garden alone, his fear scent would read as a predator alarm. The bees would defend their hives. His phobia, in a cruel irony, would create the very danger it imagined. Clover let out a soft puff of smoke, not for the bees, who were placidly going about their business, but for herself. It was a calming gesture. She needed calming. The most powerful man on the continent, a man who had reportedly stared down a mountain wyvern without blinking, a man whose body could shrug off 100 stings without his heart rate changing, was currently being held hostage by the distant possibility of an insect. And he was her mate. The moon goddess, it appeared, had a sense of humor drier than kiln-dried lumber. When the bond had first stirred 2 weeks ago in the Great Hall, it had been electric, a lightning strike to the soul. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, had found hers across a room full of bowing sycophants. She'd felt the recognition hit her, not all at once, not the clean snap of certainty, but a pull. Like a current she hadn't known was there had been running beneath her feet for years, and now she'd stepped into the river. Her wolf side sat up and took notice. Objective acquired. He'd started toward her, the crowd parting before him like the sea before a myth. And then he'd stopped. His scent, which had been a heady mix of pine, cold steel, and sovereign authority, had suddenly spiked with the acrid tang of pure, unadulterated panic. He'd stared past her, toward the open garden doors, and then he turned on his heel and all but fled. It took her 2 days to learn why. The entire castle staff knew. The king was afraid of bees. No, that wasn't quite right. His wolf side was pathologically terrified of bees, having been stung on his nose at age 4 and apparently having decided that revenge was a dish best served never, by hiding for the rest of his life. "Your Majesty," he called now, his voice carrying clearly on the morning air. It was a good voice, deep and resonant. It was a shame he was using it to shout across a lawn like a man trying to order an ale from the next village over. "Your hair is a marvel of woven sunlight." Clover raised an eyebrow. Her wolf side delivered its assessment with the tone of a military officer filling out a disappointing field report. Compliment delivered. Content, overly poetic. Delivery, cowardly. Overall score, 3 out of 10. "Thank you, Your Majesty," Clover called back, her tone perfectly even. "It's called a braid." "Yes, a brilliant braid," he yelled, recovering. "A truly regal configuration of hair." "He's trying," a small, traitorous part of her whispered. The operational part of her brain shut that down immediately. Trying is not succeeding. Protocol dictates a minimum proximity of 1 meter for effective courtship displays. "The bees are very calm today, Your Majesty," she offered, gesturing to the peaceful cloud of activity around the hives. "The lavender is in bloom." William took half a step back. "Excellent, wonderful, keep them calm. You're doing a magnificent job of containing the threat." Clover sighed. Containing the threat. He spoke of her life's work, her partners in the quiet magic of the garden, as if they were a besieging army. She ran a hand over the top of the nearest hive, feeling the faint, collective vibration of thousands of lives moving in perfect harmony. They were her family. They listened to her. They were predictable, logical, and productive. Unlike the 6'4" disaster of a king currently hyperventilating 50 feet away. His beta, a long-suffering man named Garrett, with the perpetually exhausted eyes of a man who'd seen too much, appeared at William's side. He handed the king a small, waxed paper bag. "A gift!" William bellowed, holding it up. "I have brought you a gift! It's a honey cake, made with honey from a different, undisclosed, and geographically distant apiary." The sheer absurdity of it almost made her laugh. He brought a honey cake to a beekeeper. It was like bringing a pebble to a mountain. Her wolf-side's assessment was immediate. He's an idiot. He's our idiot, Clover thought, and the realization landed with the gentle weight of a bee on a blossom. "Leave it on the bench, Your Majesty," she shouted. "I'll get it later." Garrett placed the bag on a stone bench at the edge of William's bravery, as if it were a bomb. Then they marched back toward the castle, two statues of regal incompetence. Clover found the cake still warm. It smelled of butter and spice. Tucked under the string was a single, perfect wildflower, a tiny blue thing she knew only grew on the highest northern ridges of the kingdom, the ones the wyverns used to roost on, the ones he'd conquered. He had climbed a mountain for her. He just couldn't cross a lawn. This, she thought as she took a bite of the surprisingly delicious cake, was going to be a problem. A ridiculous, infuriating, and possibly wonderful problem. The next day, William had a plan. It was a terrible plan, but it was, technically, a plan. He'd spent the night in a spiral of increasingly desperate ideas, his wolf side offering tactical suggestions with the manic energy of a war room staffer who had been awake for 72 hours, pacing around his chambers like a caged animal. His wolf wanted a shield wall, a literal shield wall of soldiers. They would advance behind it. "They're bees, not orcs," William muttered into his pillow. The wolf pivoted without missing a beat. "Fire. Burn the whole garden. From the ashes our love rises like a phoenix." Absolutely not. Abdication. We move to the tundra. There are no bees in the tundra. She can keep walruses. She's a beekeeper. She's not going to learn walrus husbandry because I have a... It's a tactical relocation and she'll adapt. By the early hours of dawn, William had landed on Plan D, the picnic. He would host a romantic, charming picnic for two. He would bring the finest cheeses, the most delicate pastries, and a wine that cost more than a small farm. 100 feet away. A good round number. A regal number. Garrett surveyed the scene with profound resignation. A luxurious blanket was spread on the grass. A wicker basket overflowed with delicacies. 2 plush cushions were arranged just so. The only issue was that the intended guest was 100 feet away, calmly tending to her hives. "You want me to shout the invitation, sire?" Garrett asked, his voice devoid of all hope. No, that's too unrefined. We need subtlety." William picked up a small silver bell. "Ring this. It has a pleasant, non-threatening tone. She will look over, see this delightful spread, and be overcome with a desire to join me." Garrett took the bell and rang it. It made a dainty ting-a-ling. 100 feet away, Clover didn't even look up. She was transferring a frame from one hive to another, a golden corona of bees surrounding her like a living cloak. "Again," William commanded, with more vigor. Garrett rang the bell with the enthusiasm of a man condemned to an eternity of ringing bells. Ting-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling! This time, Clover paused, turned her head, and raised a flat palm. "Stop." He chose to interpret this as acknowledgement. "She sees us." "She's telling you to stop, sire," Garrett said. Her wolf side, meanwhile, had arrived at a tactical decision. The problem is distance. Solution? Close the distance. The human part of her seems reluctant. Alternative measures required. Clover felt a strange shift in her own attention, a narrowing of focus she hadn't chosen. It was her wolf side, broadcasting through the one channel it could control without her permission. Scent. Every shifter's wolf could influence the body's involuntary signals, pheromones, scent markers, the chemical undertones that other wolves and, in Clover's unique case, her bees could read. Wolves couldn't puppet their human halves, couldn't override legs or arms or conscious choices, but they could leak. They could whisper through the skin. Before she could question it, a section of bees, about 500, lifted into the air. They formed a tight, disciplined sphere, responding to a territorial pheromone her wolf side had broadcast without her conscious input. The sphere began to move, purposefully, across the lawn. It floated like a tiny, fuzzy thundercloud, heading directly for the king's ridiculous picnic. 100 feet away, William saw it coming. "Garrett," he said, his voice a strangled whisper. "What is that?" "That, sire," Garrett said, already backing away, "appears to be a highly motivated delegation." Every instinct went nuclear. Flying in formation. Formation? That implies training, a command structure. She is a bee general. No, a warlord of wasps. She has been building an air force this entire time, and we have been bringing her cake. William grabbed the blanket and yanked. The entire spread, cheeses, pastries, priceless wine, went flying. He sprinted, a full-pelt, panicked flight, with Garrett trailing close behind. The bee sphere reached the demolished picnic. It hovered for a moment over a squashed brie, then floated placidly back to Clover. Not a single bee had acted aggressively. It was the most polite act of intimidation in the history of the kingdom. A giggle escaped her. It grew into a full, rolling laugh. She laughed until tears streamed down her face, laughed at the sight of the mighty King William Wolfheart fleeing from a floating ball of her fuzzy friends. She laughed until a stitch developed in her side, and she had to sit down on a crate, wheezing. Her wolf filed a brief note. Message delivered. Recommend next attempt involves significantly less cowardice. His cousin, Lord Conrad Hale, arrived that evening. Conrad moved through the court with the oily grace of a serpent in fine silks, dressed in an ostentatious doublet of black velvet slashed with silver. He looked like a magpie's idea of a funeral director. "I heard about the swarm," Conrad said with theatrical concern. "A dangerous game you're playing, cousin. Her pets, they call them, but they look like a weapon to me." "She is not a commoner, Conrad. She is my mate," William growled. "Of course. A royal mate who commands a private army of stinging insects? But the council is whispering. They see their king held at bay by a garden. It makes you look," he paused, "weak." The word landed like a punch. It was the one thing he feared most. Not bees, not death. Powerlessness. He'd been a pup, trying to protect a nest of baby birds from a fox. He'd failed. The fox had gotten the birds, and in the aftermath, he'd blundered into a flower bed and been stung. The pain of the sting, so much worse on a pup's body than it would ever be on a grown alpha's, had become tangled up with the shame of his failure. Bees were not just an insect. They were a symbol of his first, most humiliating defeat. Conrad left a trail of perfume and poison in his wake. William's new plan? Armor. Clover was pruning a rosebush when she saw it. Without a doubt, the most ridiculous thing she had ever seen in her life. Clanking its way across the lawn was a full suit of ceremonial plate armor, silver and gold, complete with a fluted visor helmet. It carried a bouquet so large it looked like an entire meadow had been uprooted. The armored figure clanked to a halt at 30 feet. A metallic, echoing voice emerged from the visor slits. "Clover Wynn, I have come to court you. I am impervious to your minions. This armor is forged from dwarven steel. It can withstand a dragon's breath. It will surely defeat the bees." A single bee, a curious forager Clover privately called Beatrice, landed on the helmet's shiny surface. Inside the suit, William went rigid. "It's on us. It's crawling on our head. A million tiny scrabbling legs. It's going to find a way in." "Begone, foul beast!" He flailed, missed the bee, and smacked himself in the head. Clang. He staggered sideways, windmilled his arms, petals flying everywhere. And then he went down like a felled tree, landing on his back with a deafening crash. The entire castle veranda gasped as one. Clover dropped her shears and ran. She didn't think, she just moved. 30 feet. 20. 10. She crossed the invisible line without a second thought. She knelt beside him, an overturned turtle in 80 pounds of metal, the bouquet crushed beneath him. Your Majesty? William? She reached for his helmet. Don't touch it! It might be booby-trapped. By whom? You put it on yourself. A pause. The bees are crafty. She found the clasps at the neck with difficulty and unlatched them. She lifted the heavy helmet off with both hands, the weight of it startling her. How had he carried this? How had he deliberately burdened himself for her? William's face was flushed, his hair plastered to his forehead with sweat, his eyes wide with a mixture of panic, humiliation, and something else, something soft and vulnerable that made her breath catch. He was staring at her, not the bees, not the armor, just her, like she was the only real thing in the world. His scent filled her senses, undiluted by distance now, pine and steel, and a deep, earthy note of longing, so raw it made her heart ache. It was the river again, and she wasn't sure she wanted to step out. It was pulling her under, and she was letting it, choosing to let it. Her wolf side filed a report, and for the first time, it sounded almost warm. Proximity protocols achieved, heart rate elevated, respiration erratic. He is an idiot, but he is ours. Acknowledged. Are you hurt? Clover asked, her voice barely a whisper. Only my dignity, he breathed. It may not recover. His eyes flicked around, noticing for the first time that there was no buzzing cloud of death descending upon him. The bees were ignoring them completely. He was in the heart of her territory, and he was fine. They're not attacking. They have no reason to, she said softly. They're not monsters, William. They're just bees. And right now, my scent is telling them you're safe. You're with me. They trust that. She paused, letting the implication land. The question is whether you do. He looked at her, really looked at her, and the world seemed to shrink until it was only the few inches of space between their faces. The court, the armor, the crushed flowers, it all faded away. It was just them, the king and the beekeeper, the man and his mate. You came for me, he said, his voice full of wonder. You fell over, she countered, but there was no heat in it. A smile tugged at her lips. It was a matter of public safety. You could have dented the lawn. He laughed, a real, genuine laugh that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. The sound went straight through her, warm and sweet as honey. He started to sit up, then remembered he was encased in about 80 pounds of metal. He flopped back down with a groan. I appear to be stuck, he admitted. Yes, Clover said, her smile widening. You do. She stood up and looked down at him, the mighty wyvern slayer, trapped by his own ridiculous plan. Don't move. I'll go get a can opener. As she walked away, she could hear him laughing, and this time, she laughed with him. It was a start, a clanging, ridiculous, humiliating start, but it was the right one. The annual Concordance of Petals was in full swing. Nobles from every corner of the realm gathered in the great hall. Clover was seated at a table far from the dais, a place of minor honor that felt more like an insult. Beside her sat Marin, her apprentice. Then came the final presentation. Men in rough, unfamiliar livery strode forward with an ornate chest. From the Beekeepers' Guild of the Sunken Valleys, their leader said, a queen of our finest stock. Inside the chest, behind a fine mesh screen, was a bee. Larger than Clover's bees, darker, with angry red stripes. It buzzed, a low, furious sound, and then everything went wrong. From hidden compartments, more of the dark bees poured out, perhaps 60 or 70. Enough for a spectacle, not a true infestation, but they were fast, aggressive, and loud. Panic erupted, and the panic was justified because this was not just a hall of alphas. It was a court event filled with betas, omegas, elderly lords, servants, children of noble families. For the alphas in the room, the stings were mere pinpricks, irritants to be swatted away. But for the rest, for the young and the gentle-blooded, 60 aggressive Vespoides in an enclosed space was a genuine medical emergency. The chaos erupted not from the wolves fearing for themselves, but from everyone trying to protect the people around them who couldn't shrug off the venom. William froze. The sight of the swarm hit him like a physical blow. Every instinct screamed one word: run. But then he saw Clover. She wasn't running, she was moving toward the chaos. Clover reached the epicenter and went still. She closed her eyes. She breathed. And then she did something she had never attempted before, pushing her calming pheromone outward. Not to her own bees who knew her, but to these foreign, furious insects. All bees, regardless of species, responded to certain baseline chemical cues. Clover's wolf nature let her produce those signals with an intensity no ordinary beekeeper could match, amplifying through her skin what a smoker could only approximate through the air. It wouldn't work perfectly, but it was enough to slow them, to dull their aggression, to turn the targeted stinging into confused, aimless circling. In that window of confusion, Conrad acted. He ripped a curtain from the wall, threw it over the chest, then drew his ceremonial sword and swatted at the disoriented insects with theatrical flair. The bees, already half pacified by Clover's invisible work, were easy targets for his performance. He looked heroic. He looked decisive. He looked like a king. And no one noticed the quiet woman in the middle of the hall, with her eyes closed and her fists clenched, doing the work that had made Conrad's gesture possible. No one except Marin, who saw everything. "These are hornet bees," Clover told William afterward, her voice clinical and precise. "Apis vespoides, quarantine-controlled species. Someone brought them here deliberately, and they left a paper trail doing it." The emergency council meeting was a nightmare. The great hall was still in disarray, smelling faintly of spilled wine and fear. The nobles who had been stung were being tended to by healers, their moans providing a grim soundtrack. Conrad, a single heroic sting on his cheek that he displayed like a medal, was holding court. Clover stood by the door, not allowed a seat. She waited, patient as a stone, while the lords debated around her. "The bees were not mine," she said at last, her voice cutting through the noise. "They are Apis vespoides. My hives are Apis mellifera. They are as different as wolves and jackals." The royal healer Brenna stepped forward. "These stings are wrong for honeybees," she said, examining her notes. "The welts are larger. The venom pattern is different. The histamine markers don't match the standard honeybee sting signature. These are not native to our region." Wayburn, an elderly lord whose southern estates contained the lavender fields that supplied the royal apiary, rose to his feet. "The healer confirms the species. These bees are traceable through their origin, breeding patterns, and controlled species documentation. I suggest the investigation follow the evidence rather than speculation." But Conrad was already shaking his head. "The question is not taxonomy, it's security. She commands these creatures through means we don't yet understand. She is either complicit in this attack or incompetent in her oversight. Either way, she is a threat. You must act, cousin. The kingdom needs to see you in control, not paralyzed by your emotional attachment to a woman who brought an unstable element into the heart of your court." William felt the trap close. Every instinct he had, the terrified pup and the mighty king alike, was screaming the same message: protect the mate. But the paranoia Conrad had seeded in him, the doubt, the fear, the sense that Clover's bees were somehow weaponized, was like a toxin in his bloodstream. "For the safety of the realm," William heard himself say, his voice hollow, "the royal apiary is to be placed under quarantine. All hives to be sealed. No entry or exit without royal guard inspection." Wayburn's face went pale. Brenna closed her eyes. The other lords exchanged glances, suddenly remembering that they had evidence but it was being dismissed. William watched the disbelief in Clover's eyes. Watched it harden into crushing understanding. She'd come to the council expecting to be heard. Instead, she'd been sentenced. She gave him a single, devastatingly empty look. Then she turned and walked out, guards falling in behind her. Not as protection, as jailers. He felt the bond between them shudder like a ship hitting rocks, the connection suddenly cold and distant. In the armory, Garrett was polishing the dent out of the coronation helmet. The rhythmic scrape of steel on emery cloth was the only sound. "She's gone," William said, his voice flat. He hadn't really slept. He'd spent the night staring at the ceiling, while his wolf instincts paced a cage of misery, circling the same thought like a wounded animal. "We failed her. We failed the mate." "She's been quarantined, sire. By your order," Garrett replied without looking up. The implied "you idiot" was deafening. "Conrad played me," William said. It wasn't a question. "A blind mole could have seen it, sire," Garrett said, his voice still mild. "Lord Weyburn practically drew you a map. The healer confirmed the species to your face. Your own mate explained the regulatory controls that would identify the culprit. You had 3 people handing you the truth on a platter, and you chose the one man who was telling you what you wanted to hear." He set down the cloth. "Conrad created a crisis only he could be seen to solve, while simultaneously neutralizing your greatest strength and exploiting your greatest weakness. It was, I must admit, tactically brilliant." "My greatest strength?" William sank onto a wooden bench. "She's my greatest strength?" Garrett finally stopped polishing. He looked at the king, his expression one of weary fondness, the look of a man who has raised a wolf pup into a king and seen all of his phases of stupidity. "You walked into a suit of armor and fell on your face for her, William. You haven't put that much effort into anything since the Northern Siege. Yes, she is your greatest strength, because she makes you try." The simple truth of it hit William with the force of a physical blow. All his life, things had come easily. Power, conquest, authority. But Clover was not a kingdom to be conquered. She was a sovereign nation of her own, and he had just declared war on her. "The bond," William whispered. When she left the hall, it was like a light went out. "I can still feel it, but it's quiet, cold, like she shut a door." "Can you blame her?" Garrett said dryly. The mention of what he'd done sent a fresh wave of self-loathing through William. "This is all my fault. This fear, it's not the sting, Garrett. Not really." And then it all came pouring out. The story of the fox and the baby birds, the helpless scrabbling in the dirt as the predator vanished into the woods, the frantic, pointless chase that ended in a flower bed and a sharp, burning pain on his nose. "It was the first time I ever failed," he said, the confession leaving a raw, hollow space in his chest. "The first time I wasn't strong enough or fast enough. The sting was just the exclamation point on my own uselessness. I never forgot it. The pain, the shame, the powerlessness. Bees became the symbol for all of it. Every time I see one, I'm not a king. I'm that terrified, useless pup again, and I'm right there with him." He buried his face in his hands. "When I saw that swarm yesterday, I wasn't a king. I wasn't a mate. I was just that pup, watching something terrible happen and being utterly powerless to stop it. Conrad saw it, Clover saw it, and I proved them right. I quarantined her to look strong because I was terrified of how weak I truly am." Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Then he said very carefully, "So, to summarize, you are afraid of bees because a fox ate some birds 26 years ago." William stared at him. "When you say it like that, it sounds insane?" "Yes, sire, it does. And yet here we are, polishing the dent you put in a ceremonial helmet by hitting yourself in the head while screaming at a single bee." Garrett picked up the helmet, considered it, and set it back down. "The historians are going to have a wonderful time with your reign." Then he sat beside him, placing a heavy, calloused hand on his shoulder, and his voice changed. "But you know what? For a pup, a bee sting is a big deal. The whole world probably feels like it's ending. But you're not a pup anymore, William. And that wasn't just a bee yesterday. That was an attack. You were right to be afraid, but you were wrong about where the venom came from." His wolf side, quiet for hours, finally stirred. Not with panic, not with conspiracy theories, just a small, raw sound, the kind a wolf makes when it's failed to protect something it was meant to protect. The kind of grief that doesn't howl. It just sits very still in the place where the failure lives. William lifted his head. The shame was still there, but now it was mixed with something else, a cold, hard rage. I need to fix this. Fixing it will require more than shouting compliments, sire. I know, William said, his jaw setting. He stood up, his posture shifting from slumped defeat to grim resolve. First, I find out where Conrad got those bees. Then, I'm crossing the lawn. He strode out of the armory, leaving Garrett with the dented helmet. Garrett picked up his cloth and went back to polishing, a small, proud smile on his face. The king was finally acting like one again. The royal apiary was unnervingly silent. The guards posted at the perimeter stood stiff and uncomfortable, swatting at the occasional curious forager from the unquarantined wildflowers nearby. A thick rope with red flags marked the 50-foot boundary William himself had ordered, a line of his own making, a testament to his failure. He walked right up to it and stopped. He could see her, a lone figure moving among the silent, sealed hives. She was checking the seals, ensuring her bees had enough ventilation. Even in her prison, she was the caretaker. Marin, her apprentice, sat on an overturned crate near the garden's edge, arms crossed, glaring at the guards with the focused resentment of a 17-year-old who has decided exactly who is wrong in this situation. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. She is our mate. We hurt her. We will fix this. His wolf side, for the first time, didn't argue, didn't offer escape routes or conspiracy theories, just a steady, terrified agreement. Together. William stepped over the rope. He made it to 40 feet before the first wave of panic hit. It was a memory, sharp and sudden. The scent of crushed petals, the triumphant flick of a fox's tail disappearing into the brush. Failure. He gritted his teeth and kept walking. 35 feet. He saw her look up. She saw him coming. Her expression was blank, unreadable. A wall of ice. 30 feet. A bee, one of hers, a gentle honeybee, buzzed past his ear. Every instinct screamed. A high, thin wire of terror pulled taut across his brain. It's just a sound, William muttered through clenched teeth. He focused on Clover, on the rigid set of her shoulders, the hurt he had put in her eyes. He kept walking. 20 feet. This was the closest he'd ever been outside of the armor incident. The air was thick with the sweet, waxy smell of the hives. He could hear the collective, muffled hum from within them. It was a sound that should have sent him running. Instead, he found it present, real. A song of 1,000 voices working as one. Clover hadn't moved. She just watched him, her arms crossed. Waiting. Daring him. He stopped at 10 feet. His heart was hammering against his ribs. His palms were slick with sweat. Every instinct, every fiber of his being was screaming at him to retreat. Clover, he said, his voice raspy. She said nothing. I was wrong, he said, the words feeling inadequate. I was a fool and a coward. Her expression didn't change. Her wolf side, the cold, clinical, operational part of her that had been silent since the Great Hall, surfaced for the first time. Its voice was flat. Data insufficient for forgiveness protocol. I let Conrad manipulate me, he continued, forcing the words out. I was so ashamed of freezing, of being weak, that I did something even weaker. I sacrificed you to save my own pride. Lord Wayburn gave me a way out, and I ignored it. Brenna confirmed the species to my face, and I ignored her. You offered proof, and I dismissed it. 3 people told me the truth, and I listened to the one person who was lying. There is no excuse, but I am so deeply sorry. A flicker of something in her eyes. Pain. Then it was gone, replaced by the ice. Your apology is noted, Your Majesty. The formal title was a slap in the face. Don't call me that, he pleaded. Please. What should I call you? She asked, her voice dangerously quiet. The man who put my life's work, my family, under armed guard? The king who believed the whispers of a snake over his own mate? Over his own healer and his own lord who tried to tell him the truth? What should I call a man who had the answer in his hands 3 times over and threw it away because looking strong was more important than being right? Suddenly, a low, unified hum rose from the hives around her. It grew in volume, a resonant, angry buzz. The bees, sealed in their boxes, were reacting to her distress, reading the pheromones her body was broadcasting, the chemical language of grief and rage. Her wolf side was leaking again, just as it had with the bee sphere, but this time through the channels of anguish rather than territorial command. They couldn't get out, but they were a living, breathing wall of sound at her back. 1,000 tiny voices roaring their defiance on her behalf. William took an involuntary step back. The sound vibrated in his bones. Clover saw his retreat. She saw the fear in his eyes, and her face hardened. That's what I thought. You can get to 10 feet, William, but you can't stay. You're still afraid, and you still don't trust me enough to stand your ground. She tilted her head, and the words that came next were quiet and precise and aimed to wound. You know what the funny thing is? You quarantined me to protect the kingdom from bees, and the bees are the only ones in this situation who haven't hurt anyone. The investigation confirmed everything. The Beekeepers' Guild didn't exist. Mercenaries hired through intermediaries, a smuggler named Aldrich Venn in the southern ports who dealt in quarantine-controlled species. And worse, Conrad had been consulting legal scholars about the right of contestation for over a month. The law books had been accessed 17 times in 5 weeks by scholars in Conrad's employ. The concordance wasn't opportunistic. It was the opening move. And Clover had been building the case from inside quarantine. Despite her heartbreak, despite her rage, despite the weight of betrayal, she had focused her mind like a lens. Marin carried messages, bringing Brenna's notes on the Vespoides venom patterns, descriptions of the chest from a sympathetic carpenter who had been appalled by the deception. Clover, with a lifetime's knowledge of bee biology, read the bees themselves. The Vespoides were 3rd-generation captive bred, she told Marin one afternoon, her voice clinical even as her hands trembled with emotion. She knew because the Crown licensing system for quarantine-controlled species was part of every royal apiarist's training. It was mandatory knowledge for anyone working with restricted hives. There are only 3 breeders licensed to maintain Vespoides colonies in the entire kingdom, she continued, and only 1 who sells to unlicensed buyers outside official channels. His name is Aldrich Venn, and his operation is in the southern ports. He brands his queen cells with a specific micro-notch on the left mandible, a mark of his stock. I saw the queen in the display box before the chest was opened, Clover said. The notch was there, clear as daylight. Someone wanted to frame me using the one thing I understand better than anyone alive: bees. They chose wrong, because I can read the bees like a language, and their origin story is written in their very structure. The renewal of the crown, the kingdom's most sacred ceremony, a public reaffirmation of the monarch's bond with the land and its people, was in 3 days. And Conrad had called a formal motion of challenge. The ancient law was clear. Any lord of royal blood could invoke the right of contestation during the renewal, calling for the assembled nobles to affirm or deny the king's fitness to rule. It hadn't been invoked in over a century. It didn't need to be. Normally, the idea of challenging a king who could rip your spine out with his bare hands was a self-solving problem. But Conrad didn't need to fight. He needed to count. He has 9 votes confirmed, Garrett said. Weyburn and his faction are loyal but account for only 7. The remaining 12 are undecided, and they're watching. They saw you freeze at the concordance. They saw you quarantine your own mate. They saw Conrad save the hall. He paused. He doesn't need a majority to win, William. He just needs enough to make the challenge embarrassing. A close vote, even one you survive, would gut your authority for a decade. Bond sickness, Garrett continued. There's precedent in the old codes. A king whose mate bond is dysfunctional, incomplete, rejected, or causing impairment can be judged unfit on the grounds that a fractured bond compromises judgment and stability. He's going to stand in front of the court and argue that your fear of your mate's bees constitutes a dysfunction of the bond itself, that you are, in effect, allergic to your own destiny. And the quarantine will be his star exhibit. He'll say even you know she's a threat. If the bond were complete, the challenge would be moot, Garrett said. But you can't function in her domain. You can't stand in her garden without falling apart. So I need to stand in her garden, in front of the entire court, without armor, without fleeing. That's 2 out of 3 elements at best. What about the claiming marks? One thing at a time, sire. Let's get you across the lawn before we discuss biting anyone. If I go to the apiary during the renewal, William said slowly, every noble in the kingdom will see me either cross that lawn or fail to cross it. That is correct. This is either the bravest thing I've ever done or the stupidest. In my experience, sire, those are the same thing. His wolf instincts offered one final assessment. We will probably be stung. Probably, William agreed. Worth it. The renewal of the crown felt like an arena. The court assembled not in the great hall, but in the vast grounds behind the castle, as tradition demanded, a living symbol of the monarch's bond with the land itself. The dais stood at one end, the assembled nobles and citizens spread before it. Banners snapped in the breeze. Everything gleamed with a kind of polished, ceremonial grandeur that made William's skin itch. And beyond the crowd, past the edge of the formal grounds, visible to every single person in attendance, sat the royal apiary. Still quarantined, still silent. The red-flagged rope was still there, a scar on the landscape. Clover was there too. She had not been invited. She had not been forbidden. She existed in a legal gray zone that Conrad had engineered perfectly. Present enough to be visible, excluded enough to be humiliated. She stood by the sealed hives in a clean linen dress, her hair in its practical braid, watching the ceremony from behind the rope line. A queen in exile in her own garden. Marin stood beside her, shoulder to shoulder, the apprentice's presence a small, fierce act of loyalty. Conrad was resplendent. He wore white and gold, the colors of renewal, and he carried himself with the relaxed confidence of a man who had already counted his votes. He stood among the nobles, shaking hands, murmuring sympathies to those who'd been stung at the concordance, making sure everyone remembered both the crisis and its hero. The ceremony began. The High Elder intoned the ancient words. William stood on the dais, the heavy crown on his head, the scepter of rule in his hand, and felt nothing but the distant pull of the bond toward the woman behind the rope. The elder finished the invocation. The moment of affirmation approached. Conrad stepped forward. Your Grace, he said, his voice ringing across the grounds, pitched for maximum audience. I invoke the right of contestation. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The elder blinked. William didn't. He'd been expecting it. The right is invoked, the elder confirmed, his voice neutral but his eyes sharp. Lord Conrad Hale may present his challenge. Conrad turned to face the assembled court with the easy grace of a man who'd been rehearsing this speech in his mirror. My lords and ladies, honored citizens, I stand before you not in ambition, but in duty. Our king, my cousin whom I love, is unwell. Not in body, in bond. His mate bond with the royal apiarist is incomplete. It is, by his own actions, dysfunctional. He let the word land, then continued. He cannot enter her domain. He cannot stand within 50 feet of her without terror overcoming him. He has, by his own royal decree, quarantined her, sealed her hives, posted guards. His own mate's home has been declared a threat to the realm. Conrad shook his head, his performance of sorrow impeccable. I ask you, if a king cannot stand beside his own mate, how can he stand for his kingdom? Bond sickness is not a crime. It is a tragedy, but it is one we cannot afford in a monarch. Murmurs swept the crowd. William could feel the tide shifting. The undecided lords were watching, weighing. Lord Weyburn stood, his old voice cutting through the noise. The right allows response, Lord Hale, or have you invoked a version of the law that conveniently omits that part? Conrad smiled. Of course. The king is welcome to respond, to demonstrate that his bond is whole, that he can, in fact, stand beside his mate without incident. The trap was elegant. If William argued from the dais, used words, excuses, promises, he was just another politician. Conrad would counter every point. The undecided lords would see a debate, not a king. And a king who has to debate his own fitness has already lost. But if William crossed the lawn, every person here knew the story. The picnic, the bell, the armor, the spectacular public fall, 49 feet, the most documented cowardice in royal history. If he crossed the lawn now, in front of everyone, and made it, the argument died. Bond sickness cannot survive a king standing in his mate's garden with bees in his hair. And if he didn't make it, if he froze or fled or was turned away, Conrad wouldn't even need the vote. William looked at the scepter in his hand. It was heavy, gold and ceremonial and useless. He set it down on the dais. It made a dull thud. I don't need to argue, he said. His voice was calm. His wolf instincts were not calm. They were running at a frequency that could probably shatter glass. But his voice was calm. He stepped off the dais. The crowd parted. 1,000 people, and not one made a sound. He walked past Conrad. His cousin's mask slipped for just a moment. A flicker of surprise, then a flash of something colder. Calculation. Where are you going, cousin? Conrad called, a hint of sharp amusement in his voice. The amusement of a man who had planned for this possibility and believed the lawn would do his work for him. William didn't answer. He walked past the nobles, past the guards, past the edge of the formal grounds. And there it was, the lawn. The flat, green, perfectly manicured expanse between the ceremony and the apiary. The 100 feet that had been his prison for weeks. Every single noble, servant, citizen, and dog in attendance could see every inch of it. Behind the rope, Clover saw him coming. Her wolf side, which had been in a state of cold operational shutdown since the quarantine, filed an alert. Incoming, unarmored, unescorted. What is he doing? Where are you going, cousin? Conrad called, with the amusement of a man who believed the lawn would do his work for him. William walked past the nobles, past the guards. He reached the rope, the red-flagged rope he had ordered strung. He looked at it. Then, without breaking stride, he stepped over it. A single bee, confused by all the activity, buzzed toward him. His wolf instincts screamed. The part of him that was still a terrified pup cried out with every fiber of its being. Turn back. You are not safe. He kept walking. 90 feet. The hives were ahead of him. A row of colorful boxes in the afternoon sun. He could hear them now. The muffled hum of the bees behind their sealed lids. 80 feet. 2 more bees, foragers from the wildflowers, drifted past. One of them landed on his shoulder. His breath hitched, his hands shook, but he kept walking. Somewhere behind him, he heard a woman's voice whisper, "Is he actually going to?" And a man's voice reply, "Someone get the healer!" Behind him, 1,000 people held their breath. On the dais, Conrad Hale was no longer smiling. 70 feet. 60. The hum was louder now. He could smell the hives, wax and honey, and the warm, living smell of Clover's world. The smell that meant, to his broken wolf instincts, danger. And to every other part of him, home. 50 feet. The old perimeter. The line he'd never crossed voluntarily. He felt it like a physical barrier, a wall of memory and fear. The pup in the flower bed, the fox with the birds, the sting that meant failure. He pushed through. 40 feet. 30. He could see her face now. It was no longer blank. Something was cracking, a fissure in the ice, a light behind the wall. Her eyes were bright. Her hands were clasped in front of her, knuckles white. Beside her, Marin was gripping the edge of a hive box, her eyes wide. 20 feet. Bees were everywhere, landing on his arms, his tunic, his hair. A small one was crawling across the back of his hand. His wolf instincts had gone from screaming to a high, thin, continuous note of terror, like a violin string played so hard it was about to snap. And then one stung him. a sharp, bright point of pain on his forearm. His body braced for the catastrophe his memory had spent 26 years promising. The overwhelming, world-ending agony that had defined his childhood. The pain that meant failure and powerlessness, and the fox's tail disappearing and everything falling apart. It didn't come. It was just a sting. A small, sharp pinch. A hot point on his skin that faded to a dull throb within seconds. That was it. That was the whole of it. 26 years of terror, and the actual thing, the real, physical reality of a bee sting on an adult body, was just a pinch. Something shifted in him. Not a cure, not a sudden absence of fear, but a hairline crack in the wall between what he remembered and what was actually true. The memory said, "This will destroy you." His forearm said, "It's a pinch, you enormous baby." His wolf instincts, recalibrating in real time, offered a bewildered update. "We have been stung. We are not dead. This is unexpected. Recommend continued advance." He almost laughed. He kept walking. 10 feet. His legs gave out. He sank to one knee in the grass, trembling, face white, a bee perched placidly on his knuckle like a tiny, fuzzy ring. "Clover," he said, and his voice was wrecked, raw and shaking and stripped of every title. "I'm here." 1,000 people watching, and he was on his knees. Clover was laughing, not unkindly, the laugh of a woman who had braced for another disappointment and instead got a 6'4" king on his knees in her apiary, with a bee on his finger, and the entire court watching him shake. "You have a bee on your hand," she said. "Her name is Beatrice," Clover said, kneeling in front of him so their faces were level. "She's very gentle. She likes warm surfaces. I am the warmest surface available, because I am sweating through every layer of clothing I own." She laughed again, and this time the sound went straight through him. She reached out and took his hand, the one without the bee, and held it. "You came," she said. "I'm terrified," he admitted. "I know. There are bees in my hair, 2 of them. They'll leave. The entire kingdom is watching me have a breakdown in your garden." "Yes," she said, and her smile was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, because it was real, and it was his, and he had earned it the only way it could be earned, by being absolutely, completely, pathetically, courageously himself. "They are." She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his. The bond between them, the one that had gone cold and distant, roared back to life like a fire fed oxygen. He could feel her, not just the warmth of her skin, but the whole, vast, specific reality of who she was. The woman who talked to bees like they were her children, the woman whose wolf side cataloged everything and judged most of it. The woman who deserved a mate who could stand beside her, and who is now watching, up close, as this particular mate did his level best not to pass out. "Conrad brought the hornet bees," she said quietly, against his forehead. It was not a question. Garrett confirmed it. Mercenaries, a smuggler named Aldrich Venn in the southern ports, and a paper trail going back 6 weeks. He was planning the challenge before the concordance. The whole thing was staged. "I know. Marin brought me Brenna's notes on the venom patterns, and a description of the chest from a sympathetic carpenter. But I didn't need most of it. I saw the queen in the display box before the chest opened. Venn's micronotch was on her mandible. I knew the breeder before the first vespoids left the box. The wing venation on the swarm confirmed they were his captive-bred stock." She raised an eyebrow. "I've spent my entire life studying bees, William. Quarantine-controlled species registries are part of every royal apiarist's training." He tried to frame me using the one thing I understand better than anyone alive. "I know," he said, "and I know something else." He looked at her, holding her gaze. At the concordance. When Conrad threw the curtain over the chest and started swatting, the bees were already calming down before he touched them. "You did that. Your pheromones." She blinked, surprise quickly masked. "You noticed. I was frozen, not blind. I saw you walk into the middle of it and close your eyes. I saw the swarm slow down. I didn't understand it then. I do now." His voice roughened. "He took credit for what you did. And I let him. That's the part I'm most ashamed of." Something shifted in her expression, the last bolt on the last door sliding back. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the willingness to consider it. William stood, pulling her up with him. He turned to face his kingdom, her hand in his. "Lord Hale has asked me to demonstrate that my bond is whole." He looked down at Clover. "I'm standing." He let the silence hold. "I crossed this lawn in front of all of you. I have 14 stings, and I am more frightened than I have been since I was 4 years old. But I want you to notice something. I have 14 stings. The woman beside me, surrounded by thousands of bees every day, has none. Not one. These bees know their keeper." The question was never whether Clover Wynne is a threat. The question is whether this kingdom is wise enough to trust the one person the bees trust completely. Lord Weyburn began to clap. Others joined. The sound swelled. "Furthermore," William continued, his voice steady and strong now, "evidence has been uncovered, by my mate, by my beta, and by the royal healer, that the hornet bees were not the product of a rogue guild, but were purchased from a controlled species smuggler in the southern ports and introduced to the kingdom by agents in Lord Hale's employ." The legal research for this very challenge was commissioned by Lord Hale over a month before the Concordance attack, proving the crisis was not an opportunity he exploited, but a weapon he built. He waited for the gravity of this to sink in. Every eye was on Conrad, watching his face go through several colors in rapid succession, none of them flattering. "This is absurd," Conrad began, but the word came out thin and reedy, the performance finally cracking. "You can't possibly—" "The smuggler has been detained," Garrett's voice rang out from somewhere in the crowd. The veteran beta stepped forward with a scroll, his bearing absolute. "He's been very forthcoming. The breeding records, the purchase orders, the transport manifests, all confirmed. Would you like me to read the relevant portions of his confession, Lord Hale? Or would you prefer to provide your own version?" The silence that followed was absolute. Conrad looked like a man who had just discovered that the chess game he thought he was winning was actually being played on a board 3 times the size he'd imagined. "And for the record," came a younger voice from behind the quarantine rope, Marin. She stepped forward with the fearless indignation of someone who hadn't yet learned that you weren't supposed to address the entire court uninvited. "I was at the Concordance. I saw Mistress Wynne walk into the middle of that swarm and calm them before Lord Hale ever touched his curtain. She did it with her body, not a sword. She just took credit for it afterward because nobody was watching her. I was." The court erupted in murmurs. Conrad looked at Marin with the dawning horror of a man who had accounted for every variable except a 17-year-old with a grudge and no sense of political decorum. Conrad looked at Garrett. He looked at William. He looked at Clover, who met his gaze with the serene, implacable expression of a woman who had spent a week in quarantine assembling the evidence that was about to destroy him. She gave him a small, professional nod, the kind of nod that said, "I told the council these bees were different. You should have listened." Conrad ran. He made it about 12 feet before the guard caught him. His exit involved undignified struggling and a shoe that came off, later found by one of Clover's bees, who sat on it for reasons known only to herself. Later, in the quiet of his chambers, a healer was applying a soothing balm to the various stings that William had acquired during his walk across the lawn. Clover sat beside him, a cup of tea in her hand, her feet tucked under her on the chair, looking more at ease than she had in weeks. 14 stings, the healer said, with the tone of someone who wanted this noted for the record. "A small price to pay," William said. 3 of them are on your neck. "They're going to swell." "He's aware," Clover said. "He's choosing to be noble about it. Let him." The healer made a sound that suggested she had opinions about nobility, but was paid to keep them to herself, and left. William captured Clover's hand. He brought it to his lips. "Clover, what I did, ordering the quarantine." "You were a king being a king," she interrupted softly. "A misguided, idiotic king who ignored his own expert, his own healer, his own most loyal lord, and his own mate because a man in a shiny coat told him what he was afraid of hearing, but a king nonetheless. That is the most accurate and hurtful summary anyone has ever given me." I'm a beekeeper. We're precise. He met her gaze, holding it. I was afraid, and I will never again let my fear make me hurt you. I swear it. She was quiet for a moment, studying him. The wolf part of her, the part that assessed and catalogued and judged, was running a final check. Heart rate, steady, scent. Pine, steel, and an ache that has nothing to do with the stings. Eyes. Open. He means it. I was afraid too, she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. When you sent me away, I thought it was because I wasn't enough. Just a beekeeper, not a queen. He saw the old wound, the one he had so carelessly torn open. He brought her hand to his cheek, pressing it against his skin. You are more than enough, he said, his voice thick. You are everything. You solved the entire case from inside a quarantine zone using entomological import regulations, a 17-year-old apprentice, and a sympathetic healer. I think that makes you overqualified for queen. Significantly overqualified, she agreed. But I'll consider the position. Beatrice had somehow gotten into the room and was buzzing around a vase of flowers. William's wolf regarded her with new equilibrium. Small, fuzzy, belongs to the mate. Stings are just pinches, not a demon. Noted. I think I'm coming around to bees. You have 14 stings. 15. I just found another one. That's not a sting, that's a freckle. I don't have freckles. You do now. The terror has changed you at a cellular level. He laughed, and Clover leaned into him, carefully avoiding the worst of the welts, and thought that she had been wrong about one thing. Her world of clear rules and predictable outcomes was fine. It was good. But this ridiculous, infuriating, brave, terrified man was better. 6 months later, they were married in the royal apiary. The transformation had been profound. Clover's garden, once a place of exile and pain, had become sacred ground. The hives were unsealed, the red flags were removed. But they kept the space, because it was theirs. Clover wore a simple dress embroidered with golden bees, each one stitched with the precision she brought to everything. William wore a tunic of dark green that brought out the color of his eyes, the stormy sea that had first seen her across a crowded hall. There was no armor, no distance, no fear. Guests were offered lightweight veils, which most accepted with visible relief. The aisle ran right through the heart of the hives, a deliberate statement. This was not a place of danger, but of home. As William waited for her, his heart thundering in his chest like it had that first day 50 feet away, a bee landed on his hand. He watched it for a moment, this tiny creature that had ruled his life for so long, that had been his nightmare and his mirror. Then he offered it his finger, and the bee crawled onto it, placid and calm. His wolf instincts filed a single-line report. Tiny friend, approved. Clover walked down the aisle, and her bees swirled around her in a gentle, celebratory dance. They were responding to the joy her wolf side was leaking through every pore, a pheromone song of happiness and completion that the hive had never heard from her before. 1,000 voices singing in harmony with 1,000 others, recognizing the moment for what it was, a joining, a bond, a home found. She reached him, her eyes shining. Having second thoughts? She whispered, nodding at the bee on his finger. Never again, he said. He leaned in, pressing his lips to the curve of her neck, right at the place where her pulse beat strongest. She felt the shift, the moment where the kiss deepened into something more, something binding. His teeth grazed her skin, gentle but deliberate, right at the juncture between her neck and shoulder, the spot that every predator instinct in her wolf recognized as sacred ground. Where a claim was made, where a forever began. The bond between them, half-formed and waiting for months, finally completed. A bite. Gentle but real. Permanent. A mark that said, mine, and yours, and ours, eternally. The bond snapped into place with the force of a door thrown open. She gasped, not from pain, there was barely any, but from the sheer enormity of what rushed through the connection. Everything he was, the fear and the courage and the ridiculous, stubborn love that had walked him across a lawn he was terrified of. She could feel him, really feel him through the bond. Not just the warmth of his skin, but the whole, vast, specific reality of who he was. The man who had climbed mountains, the king who had learned to kneel, the wolf who had learned to trust. She turned her head and bit him back, right on the shoulder, through the fabric of his fine green tunic, right where she could feel his heartbeat, strong and steady, hammering in rhythm with her own. She felt his sharp intake of breath, felt the bond double back on itself and lock from both sides. What had been one-directional became mutual. What had been reaching became holding. "That's going to stain," he murmured, looking down at the small tooth mark in the fabric, the faintest shadow of blood just visible. "Consider it an improvement," she said. The bond between them hummed with completion, with rightness, with the sensation of two halves finally recognizing each other as whole. Garrett, standing as his best man, wiped a tear from his eye. He had seen this king through puberty, through war, through a diplomatic incident involving a horse that he had been explicitly asked never to discuss again, through a suit of armor, and through a ceremonial lawn crossing watched by 1,000 people, during which the king had been covered in bees and had, at one point, appeared to be laughing. This, he thought, was worth all of it. He was also going to retire immediately afterward. His nerves could not survive a second year of this. Marin, standing as Clover's attendant, was crying openly and without apology. Beatrice the bee landed on her shoulder, as if to say, "We did good." Lord Weyburn, seated in the front row, caught William's eye and gave a single approving nod. Finally. And as the High Elder pronounced them bonded, William's wolf, the part of him that had been terrified for 30 years, that had built elaborate conspiracies about tiny winged insects, that had once suggested burning down a garden and fleeing to the tundra, had only one thought. It was not a scream. It was not a tactical assessment. It was not even, for once, delivered in all capitals. Just, mate, ours, home.